Thank you. Well, I was honored to be asked to be with you today, but to tell the truth, since I spent 22 years as a Washington lawyer and then some time out at the CIA, I'm actually honored to be invited into any polite company for any purpose at all. I usually start by a few remarks and then questions, but I want to start with one question that I will suggest someone here will ask, because they always do, which is, look, Woolsey, you were a Washington lawyer who came and went from the government several times. You weren't a career CIA officer. You weren't a real spy. Did you ever participate in any of those covert operations? And the answer is, I think I can say to this small, discreet group, yeah, I did once. And the circumstances were interesting. It was, I'd been out at the agency for some months and was, I got an invitation to my college, my Stanford reunion, and I thought, well, it's been kind of a 24/7 job here for the bulk of a year. Maybe I'll take a couple of 3 days off and go out to Stanford and see old friends from college and so forth. So I mentioned to my staff in the morning, at one of our morning meetings, that I would do that, and my chief of security came up afterwards. Now, his nickname was Buck, and Buck was about 6'8", 6'9", and maybe 280, 290 pounds. He came over after my staff meeting and said, "Director, this isn't government business." I said, "Oh, I know. I've got to fly commercial, go out there." And he said, "Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to fly in alias." And I thought, well, that's okay, so what? And then I realized what that meant is there go the frequent flyer upgrades, because I won't have them. So my two security guys, and the other guy's a little smaller than Buck. He's maybe 6'6" and maybe only 270 pounds. These two giant guys on either side of me, we go to the United flight to San Francisco. We stop by the cockpit. They show the pilot and chief flight attendant that they're carrying weapons, show that the cards that say they're authorized to do so by the federal government. We go through the cockpit, back through first class, back through business class, back through coach, and at the very back of coach, there are 3 seats right in front of the John where you can't even lean back, and they're smaller than us. I'm wedged in between these two giant guys for, 6-hour flight to San Francisco. They're there the whole time. As we get off and are walking down the jetway, flight attendant comes over and whispers something to Buck, and Buck just cracks up laughing. Now, I had not seen Buck even smile in the 8 months he had been my chief of security, so I was sort of curious. So I went over to him as we walked down the jetway. I said, "Buck, what was so funny?" He said, "You know what she said? She said, I've been on these flights for 20 years, and that is the politest and best behaved prisoner that we have ever..." So hey, covert operation successful, got to California undercover. Well, I have enjoyed very much the presentations this morning, and I particularly wanted to say to Alan Baker how thoughtful I thought his was. My first day in international law class at Yale Law School years ago, the professor, a very fine international lawyer, Leon Lipson, said, and right at the beginning, he said, "There's something you need to make sure you understand." He said, "This is the only subject you will take in law school in which there is a legitimate question whether or not the subject exists at all or not. The reason is there's no sheriff." And of course, that's the point. there's no sheriff. Maybe some of you remember an old American Western, High Noon, in which Gary Cooper, as the marshal, gets married in the opening scene. He and his lovely bride get on the buckboard to ride out of town, and he's finished with his assignment as marshal of the town. The new marshal is arriving the next day. He leaves and realizes, as he's told at the last minute, that the gang that dominated the town before, that he and the citizens had to clean up and put in prison, has been released from prison and is heading to town to kill him and anybody who had worked with him. And as he rides out of town, he realizes that even though he's not the marshal anymore, there's nobody else, because the new marshal won't arrive until the next day. So he turns around, and his new bride, first movie by Grace Kelly, she says, "Why are we doing this?" He said, "I've just got to, that's all." He goes back to town and tries to get the town to work with him, but everybody's got some excuse. And so he has to take on the gang himself. Happily, he takes it on with his Quaker, lovely little bride on his side, because she gets one kill and one assist. But as a story about what it's like to try to have a lawful society with no marshal, this is worth looking at, again, on Netflix or something. And I think it is interesting that this world of terrorism, for Israel and for Europe and for us in North America, is one where at least a major part of the problem is that there is, in fact, no marshal, no sheriff, nobody in charge of implementing these wise decisions. They may well be with respect to incitement and the rest. And that is the central problem, because we have not one but a number of terrorist threats. Now, we did pretty well defeating totalitarian and authoritarian movements in the 20th century, defeated the authoritarian German Reich of 1914, defeated the fascists, defeated the Nazis, defeated the communists in a Third World War or Cold War, whatever you want to call it. 4-0, not bad for the 20th century. 21st century is different. We have, in many ways, a much harder problem, because we have a totalitarian movement that is rooted in one of the world's great religions, Islam. Doesn't mean that all Muslims are terrorists, of course not. Especially in the Netherlands here, where you have the experience of having known Indonesia through much of its growth and know how the extremely fine, moderate Muslim history of much of Indonesian Islam, embodied in the late President Abdurrahman Wahid. There has been a great deal of variety in the world as a whole with respect to Islam as a bedrock of one terrorist movement, anyway. That movement, however, we can't understand and can't defeat unless we can talk about it clearly. Hence, Alan Baker's excellent challenge to the concept of political correctness. I try always to find out what is politically correct so I won't say it, and what is not politically correct so I can find some way to use it. It is an insidious doctrine. It's a way of avoiding responsibility by avoiding clarity. And it certainly was the case in 17th century Massachusetts that the folks who were burning the witches in Salem were a small branch of the Puritans. They weren't all of the Puritans. And the folks who ran the Spanish Inquisition in the 15th century were a small group, the Catholics. They weren't all of the world's Catholics. And the people who are supporting within Islam totalitarianism and terror are not all of Islam, of course. But we can't deal with it unless we can talk about it, and talk about it without worrying about stepping on somebody's toes. We got to go ahead and step. Now, there are at least 3 major terrorist state problems. There are others, I'm sure, but I want to mention to you 3 and something that we might do about some of them. One is North Korea. And the reason I mention North Korea is that it is a nuclear state. It has nuclear weapons and it has ballistic missiles. And it continues to threaten all the time in very explicit language its intention of using those capabilities against South Korea, against the United States, and using it generally. What could North Korea do that would be effective as a terror operation? Well, the world has been bombarded by electromagnetic radio waves now for about 4.1 billion years. The sun has been doing it since the solar system existed. And it turns out that the United States and Russia learned in 1962 with some nuclear tests that each undertook in the closing days before the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty took effect, that one can generate those types of solar waves by detonating a nuclear weapon, even a very small nuclear weapon, in space, in orbit. One does not have to be accurate. One does not have to shoot at a target on the other side of the Earth. One simply needs to put a small nuclear weapon in orbit, and then when it is above Europe or the United States or South Korea or any place that North Korea has a grudge, if it is detonated, it generates 2 types of waves, all magnetized. One is long wavelength, travels along transmission lines on the surface of the Earth, knocks out all of the transformers, and thereby shuts down the electric grid. The other is short wavelength radio waves, and those operate by line of sight, but they would knock out all of these, or our cars' computers, our washing machines' computers. Everything, of course, has a computer these days. So we stand facing a North Korean capability that could put us back into operating in the pre-electric era. And I'm not talking about pre-web in the 1980s, I'm talking about pre-electricity in the 1880s. And very few of us have enough plow horses and seeds to operate successfully in a 19th century agricultural environment without electricity. In the United States, we have 18 critical infrastructures: food, water, transportation, finance, etc. All 17 of the others depend on the electricity infrastructure. So if electricity goes down, according to a recent congressional study on the subject, it would take years to replace if it were this type of an attack, and it would end up creating a situation in which, for lack of food, water, social disruption, and the rest, we would lose something between 2/3 and 90% of the American population within the first year. I rather imagine that if the North Koreans chose to detonate above South Korea or above Europe, the casualty figures would be somewhat similar. The reason people have been so concerned about electromagnetic pulse and the North Koreans' capability to do it, because they have both nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that can put them into orbit, has been in part the craziness of Kim Jong-il and now Kim Jong-un and their rantings. We learned, I would hope, during World War II, that just because we think our opponent, in that case Hitler, is crazy doesn't mean that he can't do incredibly evil and disastrous things. So two secretaries, American secretaries of defense, former Secretary Bill Perry, and at that point in 2006, not yet Secretary Ashton Carter, they wrote a piece in the Washington Post in 2006 as the North Koreans were nuclearizing, saying they couldn't figure out any way to deal with this except to put several American submarines just off North Korea armed with cruise missiles, and whenever the North Koreans pulled anything, a satellite launch capability, anything into position to launch it from one of their launch pads, we would destroy it. And those are both very reasonable individuals. They are not people who like exhorting to the use of military force. But both Perry and Carter came to the conclusion that that was the only reasonable solution. That was now nearly a decade ago. And we still have no really good solution other than that for dealing with a North Korean terror attack. How about some other nice states, like, say, Iran? The agreement between Iran and the other states of the group of six, including the United States, that was pushed extremely hard by President Obama and has been adopted by the executive branch of the United States, even though the statutory requirements have not been met. That agreement makes it easier, I think, not harder, for Iran to move toward having nuclear weapons. It already has ballistic missiles that could put something into orbit easily. But to move toward the capacity to have nuclear weapons, to have that constrained, let me put it this way, there would have to be some effect of this agreement that made it harder for Iran to develop nuclear weapons rather than easier. But I'm afraid it makes it easier. One thing it does, for example, is it says that Iran can designate essentially any place in the country they want to be a military facility, and there can be no inspections at one of their military facilities. They also have it written into the agreement that they can also choose what samples to turn over to the international inspectors entirely at their own discretion. So if the inspectors say, you know, up there 50 miles from your northern border, we'd like to go inspect because we have some intelligence that suggests that there was some nuclear event up there and there may be some radioactivity we can find. The Iranians can say, under the agreement, we'll go collect that dirt for you and provide to you what we want to. And they have the authority to do that. This agreement is a sham, and it is very controversial still in the United States. There are many places in the world, I suppose, where people are hopeful and can't quite believe that an agreement purporting to limit nuclear capability would be as ineffective as this, or negatively effective as this, but I'm afraid it is possible. And what that means is that Iran and groups or organizations or fellow states that they wish to favor may well have some kind of simple nuclear capability before too many months to years elapse. I tend to think Iran may already have a nuclear weapon, but even if one is not willing to go that far, the fact that they will have one within a very few years is, I think, impossible to gainsay. That creates a very, very difficult to manage situation for, I think, all countries that would be on the opposite side of Iran, and Iran has been a revolutionary, anti-Western, anti-Sunni power since 1979 when Ayatollah Khomeini took over. It may be a hopeful thought to say maybe some of these smart, able, Western-oriented Iranians that all of us have met in one time or another, maybe they'll take over and run the Iranian government. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, that'd be nice. They tried in 2003. They took to the streets and they were murdered, large numbers of them, by the Iranian government, by the Revolutionary Guards. So we have a major terror challenge, we and Israel and Europe, I would say, that we have to figure out how to deal with. The third is ISIS and like-minded organizations. ISIS draws a good deal of its recruiting power and its charisma with certain groups in the world from its existence as a caliphate, from its stated stance that it is the beginnings of growth of the classic Muslim empire that existed in the 7th century, in the century after Muhammad. The expansion of the caliphate was very rapid. When Charles Martel defeated Sheikh Abdul Rahman at Poitiers in 732 and blocked the conquest of the rest of Europe, that after Spain had already fallen and a big chunk of France had fallen, he did something that was very useful for the future of Europe. But we're not sure today who would be our Charles Martel. Again, about a millennium later, Sobieski of Poland defeated with his forces the Mustafa Pasha's effort to conquer Vienna and blocked the conquest of Europe and its descent into being run by the Turks. These historical moves were dramatic and effective in their own way, but ISIS is in its own way a much cleverer and difficult problem than winning a battle in the field, whether in the 8th century or in the 17th century. Because we have to deal with this problem of figuring out how to persuade moderate Muslims as well as the rest of us to work together and to do so in the presence of a totalitarian movement, ISIS and others, that is effectively grown out of one of the world's great religions. And we are continually in the posture of having to convince everyone that we are working with, no, we're not hostile to Islam. We are hostile to ISIS and like-minded totalitarian jihadi groups. And that is just the cards we've been dealt. In the 20th century, as I said, German imperialism in 1914, as well as 3 totalitarian movements and ideologies, fascism, Nazism, and communism, we defeated. But none of those grew out of one of the world's great religions. None of those was, in its own way, as difficult to deal with as ISIS and those organizations it will spawn. I negotiated with the Soviets in 4 major sets of negotiations from 1969 to 1991 at different times. And one of those negotiations for nearly 2 years, I managed the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. I got to know Soviets, some of them, moderately well. I'd say by the 1970s anyway, the early 70s, there were virtually no Soviets who were deeply committed to the proposition of revolutionary Marxism, Leninism in a totalitarian sense. They didn't want to die for the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. They weren't going to strap on vests and blow themselves up in order to promote passages of Das Kapital. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to remodel their dachas. They were not motivated by their ideology. Their ideology was dead, and it did not help them with respect to formulating a reasonable economy. Their economy was close to worthless except for producing weapons and for pumping oil and gas. So by having won that last round, a lot of people got relaxed. And as the end of the 20th century approached and we moved into the 21st, a lot of people have taken the view that, well, time to rest. I'm afraid not. It's the other way around. Vacation is over. It is time now to focus on these extraordinarily difficult 21st century threats that we are going to have to not only live with, but defeat. Can't I say something encouraging? Yes, let me try. Carl Sandburg, the biographer of Lincoln, wrote a poem called The People Yes, about the peoples of democracies, ours, Europe's. And the closing lines are, man is a long time coming, but brother may yet line up with brother. This old anvil laughs at many broken hammers. Thank you.
Mr. Woolsey, before we open the floor for questions, I would like to ask you one question. You were mentioning 3 threats. Do you have any explanation why the perception here in Europe, maybe in the US too, I don't know, is that the third of the threats, the ISIS threat, is the biggest, the most dangerous in comparison to the other 2?
Well, ISIS is certainly the most immediate because of the attacks here in Europe and the smaller number, but nonetheless, San Bernardino, for example, in the United States. Threats that embody people with faces that can show up in newspapers and who have strapped something on themselves and killed themselves in order to kill Belgians or French or Americans or whomever, are more vivid than the concept of how one would deal with electromagnetic pulse capability and what one needs to do to the electric grid in order to make it more resilient. Seems kind of theoretical, seems kind of vague. But unfortunately, making our electric grids in Europe and in North America far more resilient probably would entail, if we don't do it right, a much greater loss in numbers of people and suffering than even a suicide vest explosion in a crowd every day in Europe and the United States. So we all can envision and think about and worry about and how to deal with what changes do we need to make in airport lines and where the security line is. These are things that one feels maybe we could do something about. And we can also do something about something like electromagnetic pulse, but very few of us, including me, are enough experts to know what kind of devices to attach to what sorts of transformers and so forth in order to bring that about. I think that it's understandable if people want to and are inclined to think about and focus on threats that are more human than electromagnetic pulse, and even if they're humans that are blowing themselves up to kill large numbers of us, it's still a lot more understandable, but it doesn't mean that we can neglect such things as electromagnetic pulse.
I would like to dangerously try to challenge the central thesis of the former director of the CIA. You mentioned that there's no real sheriff in the international society. Yeah, sure. But it seems that the Soviet Union was defeated not by trying to destroy it, but by trying to contain it. The 3 examples that you mentioned, they were closer to collapse in the case of Iran than is now the case. But even with Russia now invading Crimea, I think it's pretty close to collapse because of the sanctions and oil. Isn't there a way through unilateral sanctions to try to enforce this international law? Because that's what's being done. There is sort of a sheriff.
Well, those are beautiful hopes. I wish they had something to do with reality. I mean, from your mouth to God's ear, okay, but I wish Iran was about to collapse. What happens when Iran is about to collapse is that they kill the young people who are demonstrating in the streets. The Revolutionary Guard owns a very large share of the military industry and the infrastructure of the country. It is a thoroughly totalitarian structure that has lasted pretty much intact now since 1979. And I think the chance that it's going to come apart anytime soon based just on internal pressures is fanciful. I wish it weren't fanciful. I wish you were right. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, yes, we defeated Germany, the German and Italian, and insofar as they had one sort of kind of Japanese ideologies in World War II, and defeated the Soviets by containing and by undermining their economies. We didn't just contain, we didn't just sit there and say, don't expand. We worked, for example, with the Saudis in the 80s. Ronald Reagan was very committed to this, to keep oil prices as low as possible, which was something just drove the Soviets stark raving nuts. It was a very serious problem for them in the 80s, and it was a lot of it was a path of events that Reagan and his CIA director, not me, were responsible for pursuing. And as far as there being no sheriff, I don't know who that sheriff is. I don't know who we could dispatch to enforce international law. I wrote a piece right after the Cold War was over in suggesting that we have a brigade of British and Indian forces. They were used to working together, one kind of representing the West, one kind of representing the East, that was essentially kept ready at any point in time to be the sheriff and to enforce steps that they could with respect to international law. But probably was a fanciful idea, never came about, of course. But I don't know who the sheriff is, if there is one. Like I said, I wish it were otherwise.
As if you were foreseeing my question, Getibberman is my name. A question on leadership, not on party politics, but is there any candidate for the American presidency applying for the job of sheriff? And maybe you can also factor in Richard Haas.
I'm leaning very heavily toward Harry Truman. He was a very fine sheriff, had a lot to do with the formulation of NATO by moving in to support the Greeks and Turks against the Soviets early, working with Churchill. Harry Truman is about my favorite modern American president. Failed haberdasher, failed farmer, machine politician, but talk about an average guy rising to the occasion and being, I think, a great president, not just a good one. I'm backing him this year.
Thank you. My name is Wim Kortenhoeven. I would like to ask you the following question. You pointed out there are three enemies: North Korea, Iran, and ISIS, or IS.
Terrorist enemies.
Terrorist enemies, yes. Two of them are working together, North Korea and Iran, on a nuclear project. Two others are fighting each other, Iran and ISIS. Suppose ISIS is destroyed, which you proposed consistently for the past few years. It would pave an Iranian highway to the Mediterranean and also a North Korean highway. How would you deal with that?
Well, if Iran does defeat ISIS, but doesn't change its behavior, then I think we smile and nod once to Iran and do what we can to limit its ability to create via the Houthis and Hezbollah and on Hamas, the terror that it makes it the #1 terror sponsoring nation in the world. I would hope we would be able to persuade, perhaps in a new administration, the American government as well as other governments to re-implement a number of the sanctions which I think were unwisely and, given the statute that they were operating under, illegally lifted by the administration. I think we need to crack down economically on Iran and to stand ready to use force with our colleagues in the region, not solely Americans or Americans and Europeans by any means. I think we need to stand ready to defeat them. I mean, you know, we defeated as I said, the Nazis and the fascists and the Japanese imperialists, and then to do so we had to ally ourselves with the man who, at that point, in the beginning of the 40s, was the greatest murderer in history, Joseph Stalin. And we formed our wartime alliance with Stalin because we needed him. We had to defeat Hitler. It's called foreign policy. It's the way it works. And so we may have to do something like that again. If so, let's hope we succeed.
Thanks for coming, Mr. Woolsey. My name is Alexander and I'm studying international relations. I found it interesting that you said that the agreement with Iran was a sham, and I'm a bit critical about that statement because I think that if we look back on the last 10, 20 years and see how sanctions worked against Iran, North Korea, and the embargo against Cuba, and now we see a shift in that by the President, Mr. Obama. We actually see that in the latest parliamentary elections in Iran, moderates have won, and I think they gained a lot of wind because of the agreement. So if you claim that the agreement is a sham and we should continue to contain Iran and enforce the embargo economically, do you think that we can go on like this and do the same like we do against Northern Korea? Because it doesn't really seem to lead to any solution in the long term.
Well, sometimes solutions take a long time. And I think that the situation with respect to the Iranian elections is that they are very good at representing Revolutionary Guard members and members of their various institutions that are part of the Iranian government, the Al-Quds Force and the rest, as being moderates. It's called tahiyya, means lying to infidels, and it's not just encouraged. It's really kind of required. So I think I would be just about one of the last to accept the press or the Iranian backgrounders that say, look at these wonderful moderates that are now running things in the parliament. Now, you know, if a year or two goes by, there are other elections, some of these people take a stand against Khamenei, against some of the things that the Iranian government is doing, then we'll see. I'd love to be wrong. I'd love to be persuaded of the other being true. I think that sanctions are far from a perfect tool. It's just that it is something that can help bring pressure to bear on a state when it is taking steps that don't admit of us being able, willing or able, to assemble a military force to deal with it, and somewhere between doing nothing, or which is the same thing as giving speeches or otherwise doing nothing on the one hand, versus war on the other. In between there's really only sanctions that present themselves as a possibility. And one of the reasons this agreement is a sham is that the legislation that passed about a year ago, setting the process up and freeing the White House from needing to get the 2/3 support that it normally, in the Senate, that it normally would constitutionally be required in the U.S. system for a major international agreement. In order to get that statute passed, the U.S. government did a number of things, and one of the things they've done is acquiesce to giving up the sanctions, even though the relevant documentation, the attachments to the to the agreement and the rest have not been submitted to the U.S. government or the other governments. The clock really hasn't even started to run on this agreement, but the Obama administration has decided it's going to have an agreement, and since it doesn't follow either the statutory requirements or the constitutional requirements for a treaty, it's essentially a personal agreement between Barack Obama and the Iranians. And if whoever becomes president a little less than a year from now in the U.S., I think they would be very free to regard the lifting of those sanctions as having been premature at best and fraudulent at worst, and to go back to canceling and our trade agreements and so forth that are coming to the fore with Iran, and put them under economic pressure again.